Listen to me. There's a reason why you feel alone, why doors close, why friends disappeared, why everything around you seems still. You are not forgotten. You are being prepared. When God is about to elevate you, He isolates you. He doesn't need distractions in your ear, He needs your attention. There are seasons in life where you feel like you're standing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by silence. No one calls, no one checks in, and it feels like the world has forgotten you. But listen to me, this is not punishment, this is preparation. God does His best work in silence. Before every great move of God, there is a season of separation. Ask Joseph. Before he became ruler of Egypt, he was thrown into a pit, sold as a slave, and locked in prison. But what his brothers meant for evil, God turned for good. Ask Moses. Before leading a nation, he spent 40 years in the wilderness. God isolates before He elevates. You've been asking, why am I alone? Because God is removing distractions. You've been saying, why do I feel abandoned? Because God is stripping away what can't go with you. Not everybody can handle where you're going. Some people were only meant to be in your past, not in your future. But let me tell you something. Your isolation is a setup for revelation. In this season, God is speaking to you, molding you, refining you, because He needs you strong enough to handle the next level. The higher the building, the deeper the foundation. You are not being buried, you are being planted. So don't fight the isolation. Don't cry over what left. If God took it away, it wasn't meant for you. If He closed the door, it wasn't your blessing. He is working behind the scenes. Your name is already being mentioned in rooms you haven't walked into yet. Your blessing is already on its way. But first, He has to make sure you're ready. So hold on, stay faithful, and trust the process. Because when God finally releases what He has for you, you won't even recognize the person you were before the isolation. Isolation is one of the most misunderstood processes in a person's journey with God. It often feels like rejection, abandonment, or even punishment, but in reality, it is divine preparation. When God isolates you, He is not pushing you away, He is pulling you closer. He is stripping away the noise, the distractions, and the unnecessary influences that could hinder your growth. This is not a season of loss, it is a season of transformation. God is taking you through a process where He can speak to you without interference, mold you without resistance, and prepare you without opposition. When you look at the life of anyone whom God has greatly used, you will find a period of isolation before their elevation. Consider the story of David. Before he became king, he spent years alone in the fields tending sheep. That season wasn't wasted time, it was training ground. He learned how to fight lions and bears when no one was watching. He learned how to worship in solitude. He learned how to trust God when there was no applause, no validation, and no recognition. By the time he stood before Goliath, he wasn't afraid because his preparation had already taken place in isolation. God does not rush the process. He knows that a blessing given too soon is a blessing that can be wasted. If you place something valuable in the hands of someone who is not prepared, they will mishandle it. That is why He takes His time with you. He allows you to be in a season where it seems like nothing is happening. You pray, but there's no answer. You step forward, but doors don't open. You look around, and the people you once relied on are no longer there. Everything feels quiet. But that quietness is intentional. It is in the silence that you learn to hear His voice more clearly. It is in the stillness that you develop the discipline to walk by faith, not by sight. The preparation process is not easy because it requires shedding old habits, old mindsets, and old ways of thinking. It forces you to confront yourself, your fears, your insecurities, your weaknesses. Isolation reveals the areas that need strengthening. It forces you to rely on God in ways you never have before. When there's no one else to call, no one else to lean on, you have no choice but to press into Him. That is when your faith deepens. That is when your trust in Him is no longer based on what He gives you, but on who He is. One of the greatest struggles during isolation is the feeling of being left behind. You see others moving forward, stepping into their blessings, receiving opportunities, and you wonder, God, what about me? But what you don't see is the work being done behind the scenes. Just like a seed buried in the ground, there is something growing beneath the surface that no one can see. It takes time for roots to develop before a plant can break through the soil. In the same way, God is establishing your foundation. He is strengthening your roots so that when you do step into your blessing, you won't be shaken. Isolation is also the place where God reveals your true purpose. When you are surrounded by noise, you can easily lose sight of what He has called you to do. But when you are alone with Him, He begins to download instructions, visions, and assignments into your spirit. He starts to open your eyes to things you never noticed before. The ideas, the wisdom, the clarity, it all comes when you are still enough to receive it. Many people resist isolation because it is uncomfortable. It forces you to sit with your own thoughts. It challenges you to face what you have been avoiding. But comfort never produces greatness. Every person God has elevated had to first endure a season of separation. It is not a punishment, it is preparation. One of the most difficult yet necessary processes in a believer's journey is divine pruning. It is the moment when God begins to remove people, habits, and distractions from your life, not because He is punishing you, but because He is preparing you for something greater. Pruning is not about loss, it is about alignment. God sees what you cannot see, and He knows what is necessary for the next season of your life. He is not cutting things away to hurt you, He is cutting things away to shape you. Pruning is a principle that exists even in nature. If a gardener wants a tree to grow strong and bear much fruit, they must cut off the branches that are either dead or growing in the wrong direction. A tree that is never pruned will grow wild, but a tree that is carefully trimmed will reach its full potential. In the same way, God begins to remove the things that no longer serve your destiny. He removes relationships that are draining you, habits that are limiting you, and environments that are keeping you stuck. The pruning process is painful because it feels like loss. But what you must understand is that everything God removes, He replaces with something better. Many times people hold on to relationships that were only meant for a season. Some friendships were never designed to last forever. Some people came into your life only to teach you a lesson, and once that lesson was learned, their role in your story ended. But because of attachment, you try to keep them around, not realizing that their presence is delaying your elevation. God is not trying to hurt you by removing certain people. He is protecting you. He sees the conversations you don't hear. He sees the betrayal before it happens. He sees the distraction before it becomes destruction. When He begins to separate you from certain people, it is not rejection, it is redirection. Pruning also happens in your habits. There are certain things you used to do that cannot go with you to the next level. Maybe you were once comfortable in mediocrity, but God is calling you to excellence. Maybe you were once satisfied with complacency, but God is pushing you into purpose. Growth requires change, and change requires letting go. The habits that kept you in the last season are not strong enough to sustain you in the next. That is why God starts dealing with your mindset, your discipline, your focus. He is shaping you for the weight of the blessing. If you do not let go of old habits, they will sabotage your future. One of the most misunderstood parts of pruning is the silence that comes with it. When God starts removing people, it can feel like loneliness. When He starts changing your habits, it can feel like discomfort. When He starts shifting your environment, it can feel like confusion. But in reality, this is the moment where He is doing His greatest work in you. Silence is not absence. Just because you cannot hear God does not mean He is not working. The pruning process is quiet because transformation happens beneath the surface before it is seen in the open. Pruning is also a test of obedience. Will you trust God when He takes something away before showing you what He will replace it with? Will you believe in His plan even when you do not understand it? The greatest mistake people make is trying to hold on to what God is cutting away. If you cling to what He is pruning, you delay your own progress. There is nothing worse than trying to force something to stay in your life that God is removing. The longer you hold on, the longer you delay your elevation. In every season of elevation, there must be separation. God will never take you higher while allowing you to remain connected to things that will pull you down. That is why some doors had to close. That is why some relationships had to end. That is why certain opportunities didn't work out. He saw what you couldn't see, and He removed it before it had the chance to block your destiny. The pain of pruning is temporary, but the reward of obedience is greater than anything you could imagine. Every time God is about to elevate someone, He first separates them. This is a pattern seen throughout history, a principle woven into the very fabric of spiritual growth. Separation is never comfortable. It forces you out of your familiar surroundings, away from the people and places that once defined you. But if you want to reach the level God has prepared for you, you must be willing to go through the season of separation. He is not taking you away to harm you. He is taking you away to refine you. Look at the life of Joseph. Before he became a ruler in Egypt, he had to endure years of separation. He was taken away from his family, betrayed by his own brothers, and thrown into a pit. From the pit, he was sold into slavery, then falsely accused and imprisoned. Every stage of his journey involved separation. But if Joseph had stayed where he was, if he had never been removed from his home, he would never reach the palace. God had to take him away from where he was comfortable to place him where he was called. What looked like rejection was actually divine direction. Separation is God's way of protecting you. Not everyone can go where you are going. Some people are not equipped for your future. Some friendships will only function at your current level, but the moment you start growing, they will hold you back. This is why God starts removing certain relationships when He is preparing you for elevation. It is not that those people are bad. It is just that the role in your story has ended. You cannot carry everyone into your next season. The weight of where you are going is too heavy for unnecessary baggage. One of the hardest parts of separation is the feeling of loneliness. When God begins to pull you away from certain people, you may feel isolated. You may look around and wonder why the people you once relied on are no longer there. But this is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is changing. God needs you alone for a reason. There are lessons He wants to teach you that can only be learned in solitude. There are instructions He wants to give you that require your undivided attention. When you are surrounded by too many voices, it becomes difficult to hear His. But when He separates you, He clears the distractions so that His voice becomes the loudest in your life. Separation also reveals who is truly for you. There are people who celebrate you as long as you remain at their level, but the moment you start elevating, they become distant. Some people are comfortable with you as long as you are struggling, but the moment you step into your purpose, their attitude shifts. God allows separation to expose hidden motives. If someone walks away when God starts blessing you, they were never truly for you. True relationships are revealed in times of transition. Another reason God separates you before elevation is to break your dependence on people. Sometimes we rely too much on others. We depend on their validation, their support, their approval. But when God calls you to something greater, He must teach you to stand on your own. He will remove the people you once depended on to show you that He is all you need. This is why you may experience seasons where the people who used to help you are no longer available. It is not because they don't care. It is because God is shifting your source of dependence. He does not want you to rely on people for what only He can provide. Separation is also a process of purification. There are things attached to you that cannot go into your next season. There are mindsets, habits, and attitudes that need to be stripped away. God is not just removing people. He is removing the things within you that could hinder your future. Maybe he is working on your patience. Maybe he is teaching you to trust him fully. Maybe he is breaking old patterns that kept you in cycles of frustration. Whatever the case, separation is about refining you so that when elevation comes, you are ready to handle it. It is important to recognize that separation is not rejection. It is selection. God is setting you apart because he has chosen you for something specific. He is preparing you for something greater than what you can see right now. Many people resist separation because they do not understand its purpose. They fight to hold on to things that God is trying to remove. But when you learn to trust his process, you will realize that every separation is leading you closer to your destiny. When God isolates you, it is not to abandon you. It is to train you. The greatest warriors are not made in public. They are shaped in private. The most powerful voices are not developed on the stage. They are refined in solitude. God takes you through isolation because there are things he needs to do in you before he can do great things through you. This is the season where he molds you, strengthens you, and prepares you for the battles ahead. He is not punishing you. He is preparing you. Look at the life of David. Before he ever became a king, before anyone knew his name, before he ever faced Goliath, David was in isolation. While his brothers were in the house, he was out in the field tending sheep. He spent years alone, fighting lions and bears, with no audience, no applause, and no recognition. But what David didn't know was that his time in isolation was his training ground. God was teaching him how to fight in private, so that when the moment came to face Goliath in public, he would already be prepared. If David had never been isolated, he would have never been ready for elevation. This is why God removes you from distractions before he blesses you. There are lessons he needs to teach you that cannot be learned in the crowd. There are skills he needs to develop in you that require silence, stillness, and solitude. When you are constantly surrounded by people, you are influenced by their opinions, their expectations, and their limitations. But when God isolates you, he strips all of that away so that he can reshape your thinking. He is not just preparing you for success, he is preparing your mindset to handle success. Isolation is where character is built. Many people want elevation, but they do not have the character to sustain it. Talent can take you to the top, but only character can keep you there. That is why God takes you through a process before he elevates you. He refines your patience, your integrity, your discipline. He teaches you how to handle pressure, how to stand firm in adversity, how to stay faithful even when no one is watching. The deeper the preparation, the greater the elevation. One of the hardest parts of isolation is the feeling of invisibility. You may feel like your efforts are being overlooked, like your prayers are unheard, like your work is going unnoticed. But what you must understand is that just because no one sees you does not mean God has forgotten. He is watching. He is testing your faithfulness. He is seeing if you will stay committed when there is no audience, no recognition, no reward. Because if you can be faithful in the quiet places, he can trust you with greater assignments in the future. Isolation is also the place where God removes distractions. There are things that are attached to you in your current season that cannot go with you into your next. Maybe it's unhealthy relationships. Maybe it's old habits that are weighing you down. Maybe it's a mindset of fear and insecurity. Whatever it is, God isolates you so that he can break those attachments. He takes you away from people who drain you. He pulls you out of environments that keep you stuck. He forces you to confront the things that have been limiting your growth. This process is not comfortable. It can feel like everything is being stripped away. It can feel like you are losing more than you are gaining. But in reality, God is making room for what he is about to do in your life. You cannot receive new blessings while still holding on to old burdens. You cannot walk into your next season carrying the weight of the last one. Isolation is God's way of emptying your hands so that he can fill them with something greater. Many people fight isolation because they do not recognize its purpose. They try to force connections that God has already severed. They tried to cling to relationships that were only meant for a season. They tried to rush the process, not realizing that isolation is a requirement for transformation. If you skip the training, you will not be ready for the battle. If you avoid the preparation, you will not be able to handle the blessing. Isolation is where strength is built. It is where your faith is tested, where your endurance is stretched, where your purpose is revealed. It is where you learn to trust God even when you do not understand what He is doing. It is where you develop the kind of resilience that cannot be shaken by circumstances. God isolates you before He elevates you, because He knows that the weight of your destiny requires the strength of preparation. When God isolates you, He is not just separating you from people, He is setting you apart so that He can reveal His plan for your life. Many times we are so surrounded by noise, distractions, and other people's expectations that we cannot hear what God is saying. We get caught up in the opinions of others, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for us. But when God isolates you, He is creating an environment where you can hear Him clearly. This is a season where He starts showing you things about yourself, your purpose, and your destiny that you never saw before. Moses had to go to the wilderness before he could lead the Israelites. For 40 years he lived in isolation, away from the palace, away from everything he once knew. But it was in that place of separation that God revealed His plan. When Moses was surrounded by luxury and power in Egypt, he could not hear God's voice. But in the wilderness, in solitude, away from distractions, God spoke. He appeared to Moses in a burning bush and gave him his divine assignment. If Moses had stayed in Egypt, he would have never discovered his true calling. Sometimes God has to pull you away from everything familiar to show you who you really are. Isolation is where God gives you clarity. When you are constantly surrounded by people, their voices can drown out God's voice. Everyone has an opinion about what you should do, where you should go, and how you should live. But when God isolates you, He silences all those outside influences. He takes you to a place where the only voice you can rely on is His. This is why some of the most life-changing revelations happen in seasons of loneliness. When there is no one left to turn to, you are forced to turn to Him. And that is exactly where He wants you. God cannot reveal His full plan when you are still attached to the wrong things. Sometimes we hold on to relationships that cloud our vision. We chase after things that pull us away from our true purpose. We stay in environments that limit our growth. But when God is preparing you for something greater, He will remove anything that blocks your ability to see clearly. This is why people walk away. This is why opportunities close. This is why things that once made sense start to feel out of place. It is not rejection, it is redirection. God is removing everything that is not aligned with where He is taking you. Isolation is where God reshapes your desires. There are things you thought you wanted that will no longer satisfy you. There are places you once dreamed of going that will no longer feel right. There are plans you once made that will no longer match who you are becoming. God is stripping away everything that was built on human ambition so that He can replace it with His divine vision. What you thought was important will start to lose its value. What you once chased after will no longer excite you. This is not a loss. It is a transformation. God is shifting your heart so that your desires align with His will. One of the most powerful things that happens in isolation is self-discovery. When you are surrounded by people, it is easy to define yourself based on their expectations. You become who they want you to be. You say what they want to hear. You do what makes them comfortable. But when God isolates you, He strips away all of those false identities. He forces you to ask, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I without the titles, the approval, and the validation? The reason isolation feels so painful is because it exposes everything you once used to define yourself. But in that process, God is revealing the real you, the person He created you to be before the world tried to shape you into something else. Isolation is where God gives you instructions. When Jesus was preparing for his ministry, he did not go straight to the crowds. He went into the wilderness. For 40 days, he was alone, fasting, praying, and being strengthened by God. That time of isolation was necessary before he could step into his purpose. Many people want to walk into their calling without first going through preparation. They want the platform without the process. But if Jesus needed time alone with God before stepping into his mission, how much more do we? God isolates you before he blesses you because he wants you to be ready for what is coming. He does not just want to give you success, he wants to give you the wisdom to handle it. He does not just want to elevate you, he wants to ensure that when you reach the top, you do not fall. Many people miss their destiny because they refuse to embrace the season of isolation. They try to rush the process. They try to force their way into rooms that God has not yet opened. But when you trust his timing, when you surrender to the process, when you allow him to shape you in the quiet seasons, he will reveal a plan greater than anything you ever imagined. Isolation is one of the greatest tests of faith a person can go through. It is the moment where everything familiar is stripped away, where the people you once depended on are no longer there, and where the path ahead seems unclear. It is in this space of silence and uncertainty that God asks one simple question: do you still trust me? It is easy to have faith when everything is going well, when the doors are opening, when the blessings are flowing. But true faith is tested in the seasons when God is silent, when the answers are delayed, when the prayers seem unanswered, and when you feel like you are walking alone. When God isolates you, he is not only preparing you, he is proving you. He wants to see if your faith is built on circumstances or on true trust in him. Will you still believe when the promise seems far away? Will you still hold on when there is no sign of breakthrough? Will you still declare his goodness when everything in your life is being tested? These are the moments that separate those who only seek God for his blessings from those who seek him for who he is. Look at Abraham. God gave him a promise that he would be the father of many nations, but before that promise could manifest, God took him through a season of isolation. He told Abraham to leave everything familiar, his family, his homeland, his comfort, and go to a place that he would later reveal. Abraham had no map, no instructions, no details. All he had was a word from God. He had to walk in faith, trusting that even though he could not see the destination, God had already planned it. That is what faith looks like: walking even when you do not understand, believing even when nothing around you makes sense, and holding on even when everything inside you wants to give up. Isolation forces you to depend on God in a way you never have before. When everything is stripped away, when the people you trusted are gone, when the opportunities you counted on have closed, when the support you relied on has disappeared, you have no choice but to lean on him. And that is exactly where he wants you. Because as long as you have something or someone else to rely on, your faith is divided. But when you are alone, when the only thing left to hold on to is him, that is when you truly learn what trust means. The reason isolation is so difficult is because it exposes our fears and weaknesses. When you are surrounded by people, you can hide behind distraction. You can fill your days with noise, with activity, with busyness. But when God pulls you away, when he places you in a season of stillness, every insecurity, every doubt, every hidden fear rises to the surface. You are forced to confront your own thoughts, your own struggles, your own weaknesses. It is in this place that God begins to refine you, to strip away the things that have been holding you back, to strengthen the parts of you that need to grow. This is what happened to Job. He was a man who had everything: wealth, family, success. But in one moment, everything was taken from him. He lost his children, his possessions, his health. His friends turned against him. His wife told him to curse God and die. He was left with nothing but his faith. And in that place of suffering and isolation, Job had to make a decision. Would he let go of his faith, Or would he trust God even when he did not understand? That is the real test of isolation. It is the moment where you decide whether your faith is built on what God gives you or on who God is. God isolates you before blessing you because he wants to strengthen your trust in him. He wants to remove anything in your heart that is not fully surrendered. He wants to build a foundation that cannot be shaken, because if you cannot trust him in the quiet seasons, you will not trust him when the blessings come. If you cannot remain faithful in the wilderness, you will not remain faithful in the palace. Isolation also teaches you spiritual resilience. Many people think faith means never struggling, never questioning, never feeling weak. But true faith is built in the moments when you have every reason to give up, yet you choose to believe anyway. It is built in the nights when you cry out to God with no answer, yet you continue to pray. It is built in the seasons when you feel completely alone, yet you refuse to walk away from him. This is what God is developing in you. He is strengthening your endurance. He is stretching your ability to trust. He is preparing you to carry the weight of the blessing he is about to release. Isolation also reveals whether you are truly seeking God or just seeking what he can do for you. Many people only pursue God when they need something from him. They pray when they need a breakthrough. They worship when they need a miracle. They seek him when they are in trouble. But the moment things get better, the moment life is smooth again, they drift away. This is why God isolates you before he blesses you. He wants to see if your love for him is real. Will you still seek him when the answer is delayed? Will you still worship him when the door remains closed? Will you still trust him when everything in your life seems to be falling apart? Isolation is painful, but it is also necessary. It is where God separates those who are truly devoted to him from those who only want what he can give. It is where he breaks every false dependency so that your foundation is built on him alone. It is where he teaches you how to stand firm, how to endure, how to trust without condition. God is not just preparing you for a blessing. He is preparing you to carry it well. And that preparation happens in the silence, in the solitude, in the moments when you feel completely alone, yet God is closer than ever. If you find yourself in a season of isolation, don't mistake it for abandonment. God has not forgotten you. He is setting you apart, not to break you, but to build you. He is not punishing you, he is preparing you. Isolation is the training ground where faith is fortified, trust is deepened, and purpose is revealed. It is where God removes distractions, refines your character, and strengthens your ability to stand firm when the blessing arrives. Think about this. Would you rather step into a blessing unprepared and risk losing it, or endure the process, be strengthened by God, and walk into your destiny fully equipped? That is why the isolation comes first. It teaches you endurance, resilience, and unshakable trust in the one who holds your future. So don't rush the process. Don't fight the silence. Don't resist the stillness. Instead, lean in. Trust that the same God who called you into this season will bring you through it. Because when the time is right, when you are ready, what he has prepared for you will be greater than anything you could have imagined. Stay faithful in the isolation because your blessing is on the other side of it.